Hello crafties and happy holidays. Welcome to another video tutorial. My name is Infinity and today we are moving on to the third and final part of the cable spoke rug pattern. So before we get started, there are a few things I want to remind you guys of and talk about. The first part of this tutorial was made about 2 weeks ago, so you guys might not remember everything, but today we're going to finish out how you would end this project, and then I'm going to show you guys how to attach the mat on the bottom that I like to put on the bottom of my rugs. And for that, I'm just going to run over some supplies because you do have options. First of all, you're going to need the yarn that you're working with, which I do have. This is still the same skein, so it's a pretty good skein. You're going to still need your crochet hook, of course. Now this is optional. You can have needle and thread, or you can sew your matting on with the yarn that you have. So with the needle and thread option, you can have your standard little needle, or you can have upholstery needles or home craft needles, whichever you fancy. Or you can use your yarn and your yarn needle, which is a favorite of mine. It's easier to see. You're going to need regular scissors, and you're going to need snips. So the thing is with the scissors, if any of you sew, you know that you don't use your good scissors or your good snips for cutting materials other than fabric. So with that, these are my just dollar store scissors that I'm going to use to cut out the shape of my matting that I have over here. And I'm just going to lay those to the side safely. And of course your snips. Now these are my yarn snips or my thread snips, so these are what I'll be using for those two things, but these are the only two things that I use these for, which keeps them sharper longer, and that keeps you from having to replace a $20 pair of scissors. So without further ado, we're gonna get started. Alright, so here you can see that I've expanded out the pattern, not too much, but just enough to show on camera. And I finished off doing a row where we were just doing the increasing stitches and the front post double crochets on top of those trebles. So that's where you want to be. Whenever you get to your stopping point of your pattern, you're going to want to end on one of those rows where you've done those 6 front post double crochets. And so I'm going to turn my work back around where I was working, and what I do here is just pull up my loop, and I'm going to chain 2 as I normally would. So 1, 2, and I'm going to work this row like any of the other rows like this one. So I'm going to do my regular increases after this. And if you don't remember, that's just yarning over. Yarning over and putting 2 double crochets in the same stitch. Alright, and then we are going to make essentially just a bunch of stitches until this last stitch, but you're always going to want to count. So in this case, I believe I ended off with 21 stitches in the previous row. You can double check. We're going to find that increase from the previous row and we're going to count over. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay, so I was right. So this row, when we increase, we are going to have 23 stitches between those increases. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to make sure my yarn is right and that is pulling. And I am going to start making those stitches. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, and there's 5, and there's 6, And there's 7, if I don't mess that up. Here's 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23. And we have just one more stitch to go into, and that is our stitch in which we will be increasing. So I'm going to put 2 double crochets in this last quote-unquote normal stitch. Alright, and then we're just going to work our 6 front post double crochets. So yarning over and going behind that loop and creating that double crochet on top of it, like so. And again, they call it front post in case you're not familiar with them, because in working these stitches it just pulls them forward. I know it used to confuse me just a little bit when they'd say make a front post crochet of some sort, and I'm like, but I'm going behind the stitch. So it's just one of those really clearly defined kind of definitions. And so this is how we're going to work this round. Basically giving our twists a sort of straight end point. It's no longer twisting and curling. I mean, if you wanted to do this for a bit and then go back to the cabling, you could, if you're still expanding. But to me, it looks nice when you have this sort of finish to it. And that's also how I end my scarves with cables, even though they're worked differently. So after we do those 6 front posts, we are going to start back working those regular double crochets. And so this stitch right here, so if you look at this previous row at the increase, make sure you're going into this stitch, because it's very easy to skip over it because it looks like it's being covered by this last front post double crochet, but it's actually a stitch that you're supposed to go into. So I'm going to go into that and I'm going to make an increase. And a question may come up as to why I am still increasing even though this is a finishing row. Well, the answer to that question is you don't want it to ruffle on you at the last minute, because it very well can do that, and you just want it to lay flat. So say that I decided to spread this pattern out, pin it down, block it. I wouldn't have any issues, as it were, trying to block it out, because I have consistently increased throughout the entire pattern. But if I decided to not do that for this last row, there's a possibility that this thing would curl up kind of like a fitted sheet, and that's something that you do not want, especially if you've made this thing any bigger than I have at this point. That's 2, and this is 3, this is 4, and this is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And also, if you're just now tuning into the videos, first of all, thank you and welcome. If you are unfamiliar and just trying to learn how to crochet, I do have some old videos on how to get started. I plan on redoing at least the first 3 right now, too, as far as my memory goes, where I had the awkward camera positioning, just to make those a little bit better, and also go into some more detail, because there are some things that I could go over and I would like to go over, and I realized that, also due to some suggestion that I got from my awesome grandmother who follows the channel. That's something that I'm looking to do between now and the new year, so stay posted on that. Alright, I'm coming up on that last stitch. Just gonna make that increase. And now I'm gonna make my 6 front post double crochets. That is still such a mouthful. And eventually, after you've been crocheting for a while, it goes from full terminology to, oh, just make those front posts and back posts. That's very easy to fall into when you're talking about it. But other people will not know what you're talking about. They absolutely will not. So there's those first 3. And I'm just going to yarn over and make those last 3. Okay. So you have those first 2 spokes done of this final row. Like I said, if you've made your rug bigger, like actually rug sized, then you're going to have way more stitches between here than I do. So I'm going to meet up with you guys once I've made it around and gotten back to the beginning of the row. Alright? Let me see, that's good. Alright guys, so I am back at the beginning of the row, and I am just going to close it off with a slip stitch, just like so. And I'm going to chain 1 and fasten off, just like that. Okay, so at this point you're going to want to sew in your ends. So for me, if you have the condensation, that's fine. Usually you can just kind of roll your yarn up and weave it through the yarn needle if you don't have your condensation or water, or if you don't want to use your fingers, you know, saliva stuff. Once you get it threaded, all you're going to do is take it through your project and sew it in an unnoticeable area on the back side. And the thing about this design, when I was doing it, I wanted to make sure that this was possible without necessarily putting it through the cables, which was fairly successful, I think. So I'm just putting it down through these double crochets, kind of in a straight line-ish, kind of, just somewhere where it's not noticeable. And if you have your fray check, you can also tack it down with that. You don't necessarily have to be as sparing with it, because this is something that's going to be heavy usage, I want to say. If you made a, like I said, an actual rug-sized rug, people are going to be walking on it. People are going to be, stuff happens to rugs. So you're going to want to make sure that it's durable and tough. And I'm just going to sew in that middle string from where we started, because if you remember, starting it off, you couldn't really weave it in as you went along like you do with certain other projects. So you can just kind of take that around that inner circle if you can see it, and if not, you can just kind of bring it up through the pattern until you can find a clear space to weave it through. Just like that. I'm going to put my needle to the side and clip my string, and we are good. So I do have some of this skein left over, very little though, and what I'm going to do is just go on and thread my yarn needle because I know I'm going to need it. Now it's totally optional now, because yarn is such a thick sort of thread, you can sew it with just a single strand. You don't have to double it up as you would with a sewing needle. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to use my yarn needle and my yarn. Words escaped me today for some reason. And even though, like I just said, you don't have to thread it twice or double up that threading with it, I was doing that anyway out of habit. So what I'm going to do is just kind of flatten out my rug. I'm laying the bottom side up. And what I am going to do here, kind of looks like a clover. What I'm going to do here is kind of eeny, meeny, miny, moe, and find a spot to stick my sewing needle or my yarn needle. And I'm going to just lightly pull from my working yarn some yarn, and I am going to go around the circumference of this rug with the yarn, the sewing yarn. And this is just a good habit to create for yourself when you are doing certain projects such as making sweaters or things like this. You want to make sure that your thread or your yarn wraps around your project all the way at one time. And it's okay if you're not laying your yarn out perfect. You want to give yourself some wiggle room. And what I will do sometimes is even go past my starting point for quite a ways, maybe a few inches, something like that. And I'm going to find my snips, and I'm going to cut my yarn where I feel comfortable and put my extra to the side, because there's nothing worse to me than running out of a thread or a fiber when you're trying to sew and you have to kind of fix that, and it just ends up being a mess in the end. So that's good and fine. We have our yarn. Now what we want to do, if you're going to put the matting on the bottom of it, this rolls probably like $3. It's not very expensive. You can either get this stuff, which is like a counter grip, which works better on my tile floor than the actual rug material, which is odd, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. But you roll it out, and you don't want to take this completely to the edge of your project, but more or less in the middle. And the reason being is just aesthetics, pretty much aesthetics. And then sewing to the edge, if something rips, you won't be able to sew this back to the edge. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've kind of measured it out and marked it, I'm going to take my regular scissors and start cutting my material. Now if you want to, what you could do, if it bothers you, you could round off this square piece of material so that it's round like your project, or you can leave it like this. I tend to leave it, not because I don't want to cut it, but because it covers more space, and the less sliding around this thing does on this floor is the best thing for me. So kind of even that off, and I'm gonna pull up my needle here, and what I'm gonna do is just place it. Think about placement, and I'm going to decide whether or not this is good placement for my project, which I feel, yeah, it is, because at this size it's likely going to go on a table and not on the floor. It might go on my little spin around thing, so it doesn't have to have a whole lot of non-grip material, I'm sorry, non-slip material. So I'm satisfied with this, and what I'm doing a little bit off camera is just putting the knots in my yarn so that it catches through these holes. Now it's very important that you are working on the back side of your rug, because you don't want your sewing in on your pretty side. I know it sounds like a common sense kind of thing, but it's something people don't think about as they're sewing. And if you're like new to sewing or seaming things together, that's definitely something that you need to be conscious of, especially if you're planning on gifting these things, or I don't know, you just want them presentable. So I'm kind of feeling around, because like I said, I don't want my sewing to show through the other side. So I'm going to lightly pick up my matting, and looking through here, kind of place my needle through there somewhere, where I just about think is the middle. It can be a little off, and that's cool. Alright, now a thing about this, sometimes the knots in your yarn can cinch closed a little tight, like mine just did, so you're going to want to secure that. And you can do that by just weaving your yarn in, or your thread in, through the holes in the matting and just knotting it there instead. And this kind of establishes a front and back to the matting, which is good. Or at least to me, because I like to know which side is which. Just a light little thing. Now if you're using a regular sewing needle, your needle will likely go into the solid parts of this grid thing and you'll be just fine. But you're going to want to make sure you use a good thick thread, quality thread, because either it'll snap, or depending on what you do, you can kind of tear through this stuff. It's not like invincible or unbreakable, but you're going to want to make sure that your thread is good and strong. Again, because this is going to be a high use kind of thing, you don't want your rug breaking apart on you, especially during like high traffic times, like you have people over for the holidays and things like that. They're going to be treading all over it. So what I'm doing is putting my needle straight through the hole. Now this is something that I tend to do with even pom-poms. It's just a method that I like to use to secure it, or give it myself that sense of security that, okay, my project is secure to the very core of this item. Alright, and you can see from the tugging that I'm doing that it's through there. And if I were to flip this over, it's coming straight out the center, which is fine. This is fine. But this is about the only place that you'll want to see this coming through. And what I would try to do if I flip this over, which I have, I would find a good inconspicuous spot, not back through the center, but maybe somewhere between the stitches in the second row, and just push that through there and pull it relatively tight. and that makes it invisible, but it also doubly secures your project to the matting and the matting to your project. So I'm flipping it back over to the wrong side, and what I'm doing now is I am going to see these stitches that I have made that have these ridges, because you know when we first started out and we did that circular row of increase that it created those ridges, which are great for sewing in my opinion. I love sewing these because it makes the backside evident, and if you're sewing on something like matting, then that is very important. So here's where I'm just going to kind of stitch this down and tack it down. And I'm going to be quiet and just meet you guys back when I finish making my little circle here. Alright, crafties, I am back to the end. Well, not the end rather, but back to where I started stitching, and I am just pretty much making this last stitch go under this first loop. We're trying to. And now that I have that, I can just sew under this loop and knot it to secure it rather. Me and speech have not been friends lately. Alright, so as you can see, I did sew around that first little circular set of ridges, and then I went about the edges of this mat rather, and you'll notice that I rounded the corners when I sewed this down. That was not only to give me more yarn, but also to just kind of give myself some leeway, like if this tears I could do a repair on it, as opposed to having to rip the whole thing off, as opposed to like sewing it completely to the edge like here. But that's what it's all about. And now that that is secured, I'm going to snip it. If you have fray check, you could go on and use it. Like I said, you don't have to be as light-handed with it with a project like this, in my opinion, because, well, let's face it, stuff's gonna happen. And snip. And so I'm gonna flip this over just like that. And you can see on this side it looks pretty decent. It's flattened out. Now what I would do after you get your matting, if you haven't done this already, I would stretch this out over some matting pads, and I would pin this down, dampen it, and let it stretch out and shape up before I started to use it, just because you see along the edges that it's doing its thing that it was doing before it got sewed down. So that brings me to the end of this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and until next time, happy making. Alright, thank you crafties for tuning in and making it to the end of another video. This has been a really awesome first few months on the channel. I want to say a huge thank you to all my supporters and all my friends who decided to subscribe and support my channel as it grows. That, you guys rock. That just means so much to me. The written pattern for this make along should be available sometime between now and the new year, Everything's tentative right now. I am working hard on getting that out there for you guys. So stay tuned on Twitter and Pinterest to keep up with the release of that. Not only that, but when it goes up, it will be on the Craftsy page and it will be for sale. I am still sorting out the pricing on it, but if you want to continue to support the channel and the startup, I would ask that you go over to the Craftsy page and make a purchase. Not only that, I have a special treat for my coffee supporters. I love you guys so much, and what I do would not be possible without the contributions that I get from my audience. So with that, I have 2 exclusive coupon codes for my merch shop. If you don't know about my merch shop, it is over on Teespring, and the link to that is down in the description, so head on over and check that out. If you're not a coffee subscriber, go on and subscribe, or just do a one-time donation of $10. That's my minimum. And yeah, I have 2 very exclusive coupons that only my supporters are able to get to, so you'll have to subscribe to find out. And until next time, happy making and happy holidays.